The wind that crawls down Wolf Creek Holler in November carries more than frost, it carries memory, and memory here has teeth. In the year 1888, when the leaves fell red as fresh blood and the creeks ran black under starlight, folks still spoke in low voices about the woman who vanished from the upper ridge. They called her Poor Eliza, though no one had dared say her name aloud since the night she was led away. Some claimed they heard her still, after midnight, when the dogs refused to bark and the oil lamps burned blue, her voice drifting between the trunks of the pines like a thread pulled loose from a burial quilt. They said she had been traded. Not stolen, not murdered in the common way. Traded. One barren wife for one good horse, sealed with a handshake and a swallow of corn liquor beside a dying fire. The men who did it never spoke of it again, not to preachers, not to sheriffs, not even to the dark when it pressed against their windows. Yet something spoke for her. Something walked the deer paths where no foot had business walking after frost. Travelers on the old trace road would spur their mules faster when they heard it, a woman's cry, thin as a fiddle string drawn across bone, calling a name that belonged to the living and the dead alike. And always, beneath her voice, another sound, slow, deliberate, the heavy fall of unshod hooves on frozen ground, coming closer when any man dared light a torch to see what followed. In Wolf Creek they will tell you the woods keep their own ledger. Debts written in hoofprints and wedding rings. Debts that come due when the moon hides its face and the wind turns sharp enough to cut a soul loose from its lying tongue. This is the night that ledger opened. Listen close. She is still walking. And she remembers exactly what she was worth. In the spring of 1885, when the dogwoods were just beginning to bleed white along the ridges of Wolf Creek, Eliza stepped down from the wagon that had carried her over the Cumberland Gap and into the rest of her life. She was 22, small-boned, with hair the color of river silt after rain and eyes the pale gray-green of creek water in March. Folks said she looked breakable, like a china cup carried too far from the cupboard, but there was a steadiness in the way she held her chin that made the older women purse their lips and the younger men look longer than was polite. She had married Caleb Whitaker 6 weeks earlier in a hurried ceremony outside her father's tobacco barn in Tennessee. The preacher had smelled of camphor and moonshine, and the only witness had been Caleb's sour-faced cousin who kept spitting tobacco juice into the dust. Eliza wore her mother's remade wedding dress, the lace yellowed and mended so many times it felt more like a shroud than a promise. When Caleb lifted the veil, his smile had been quick and hungry, the smile of a man who believed he had finally outrun the poverty that had dogged his family for 3 generations. He saw land when he looked at her dowry, saw strong sons when he looked at her hips, saw a future where nobody would ever again call a Whitaker poor white trash. Wolf Creek Holler lay cupped between 2 knife-back ridges, a place so far back in the hills that the sun seemed to hesitate before it slid down the slopes each morning. The cabin Caleb brought her to was little more than a single room with a loft, the chinking fallen out in places so that the wind sang through the walls at night like a sick child. There was no glass in the windows, only greased paper that turned the light the color of weak tea. The nearest neighbor was 2 miles through laurel hells thick enough to swallow screams. From the first week the whispers started. Eliza's monthly bleeding came and went like the new moon, regular as preaching, and no baby quickened. The older women watched her belly the way farmers watch the sky for rain, their eyes narrowing each time she passed with an empty apron and no swelling beneath it. Barren. The word floated behind her when she carried water from the spring, when she bent over the wash kettle, when she walked to the corn crib with her shawl pulled tight against the wind. It was never said to her face, "Mountain people are careful that way," but it was carved into every sidelong glance, every too-sweet offer of molasses cake, to sweeten the womb. Caleb heard it too. At first he laughed it off, told the men at the mill that his wife was just slow to catch, like a late garden. But as the months became seasons and the seasons turned cruel, the laughter thinned. He began to look at Eliza the way a man looks at a lame mule, something that had once seemed a bargain now only a burden. In the dark, when the fire burned low and the wolves talked back and forth across the ridge, he would turn his back to her in the bed they shared and lie rigid, counting the cost of every sack of meal, every plug of tobacco, every promise that had come to nothing. By the fall of 1888 the name Eliza Whitaker already carried a hush when it was spoken, the hush that falls over a room when someone mentions a stillborn child or a hanging tree. 3 years without issue in the mountains was more than disappointment, it was a judgment. And judgments, in places where the law was a week's ride away and God seemed to have turned his face, were settled in ways the outside world had no name for. Eliza felt the weight of it settle on her shoulders like a yoke made of whispers and measuring glances. She still rose before dawn to milk the one cow, still scrubbed the pine floors until they smelled of lie and regret, still hung her husband's shirts on the line with hands that never quite stopped trembling. But when she caught her reflection in the black water of the horse trough, she no longer recognized the woman staring back, a woman with hollowed cheeks and eyes that had learned to look past tomorrow. She did not yet know that tomorrow had already been sold. By the autumn of 1888 the frost came early to Wolf Creek, blackening the pumpkin vines and turning the creek water so cold it burned the skin. Caleb Whitaker's tobacco crop had failed again, the leaves spotted with blight and too few to sell for more than a handful of salt and coffee. The mule had gone lame in the spring, and without a strong horse the winter plowing would be done by hand or not at all. Debt hung over the cabin like smoke that would not lift. The storekeeper in Pineville had already cut him off, and the taxman rode the Trace Road twice a year with a ledger full of names that ended badly. Caleb's older brother Amos lived higher up the ridge, a widower whose wife had died birthing a child that followed her to the grave 2 days later. Amos owned the best bottomland in the holler and a mare named Bess, coal-black, deep-chested, the kind of animal that could pull a loaded sled through mud axle-deep and still have wind left for the hill. Men spoke of that horse the way they spoke of rich dirt or a straight-shooting rifle, something a man built his life around. Amos had no children, no one to leave the place to, and the loneliness had settled into him like rot in an old log. The two brothers met one October evening at the spring house where the branch water ran clear and bitter. Caleb carried a stone jug of his last batch of liquor, Amos brought a twist of home-raised tobacco. They sat on upturned buckets while the sun bled out behind the pines, passing the jug back and forth until the edges of the world softened. Talk started with weather and crops, drifted to the price of horses at the Prestonsburg sale, then circled, slow as a buzzard, to the thing neither had named yet. Caleb spoke first of Eliza's barrenness, his voice low and careful, the way a man tests thin ice. He said the words as though they belonged to someone else, 3 years gone and no sign, no swelling, no hope. He said a man needed sons the way a field needed rain, and without them he was only marking time until the land swallowed him. Amos listened without looking up, rolling the tobacco slow between his palms, the silence stretching until the crickets themselves seemed to hold their breath. Then Amos asked, quiet as falling ash, what Caleb figured his wife might be worth to a man who had land enough for 2 lifetimes and no one to warm the bed or work beside him. Caleb laughed at first, a short bark that died quick in the dark. But the jug passed again, and the idea took root in the sour mash warmth, twisting like a briar through the cracks of desperation. They bargained the way mountain men always bargained, slow, sideways, never quite meeting each other's eyes. Caleb spoke of the mare's strong back and good teeth, Amos spoke of Eliza's quiet ways and tireless hands. Words like loan and temporary. November 17, 1888, came in on a wind that smelled of iron and coming snow. The sky stayed the color of a bruise all day, and the chickens would not leave the roost. Eliza noticed the quiet first, the way Caleb moved around the cabin without his usual cursing at the cold, the way he kept glancing toward the ridge as if waiting for a sign. When dusk bled purple across the treetops he told her they were going to Amos's place to borrow a setting of eggs from his hens. His voice was too even, like a man reciting something practiced in secret. He made her put on her Sunday dress, the brown calico with the tiny faded flowers she had not worn since her wedding day. He said the path was muddy and tied a clean flour sack blindfold over her eyes so she would not ruin her shoes. She laughed at that, a small cracked sound, because she owned only the one pair and they were already split at the seams. But she let him knot the cloth, trusting the way a woman trusts after years of having no other choice. He led her by the hand down the footlog across the creek, then up the switchback trail that climbed through stands of laurel so thick the darkness felt solid. The cold bit through her shawl, and pine needles worked through the thin soles of her shoes until her feet bled. She stumbled often, each time Caleb's grip tightened, not gentle, not cruel, only certain. Somewhere above them an owl called once and did not call again. The smell changed after a while, from damp leaves to the sharper scent of cut firewood and horse. She heard the creak of a gate, the soft snort of an animal shifting its weight. Caleb stopped. His hand left hers. She reached for the blindfold, but his fingers closed over her wrist like a trap. "Leave it," he said, and the words came out hoarse, as though dragged across gravel. A second set of footsteps approached, deliberate, heavy. Boots on frost-crusted ground. She knew the rhythm of them the way she knew her own heartbeat, Amos, always heavier than Caleb, always slower. The air carried the bite of corn liquor and the warmer, darker smell of a man who had been waiting. Caleb's voice, when it came, was almost a whisper. "She's here." Amos did not speak. He only reached out and took her elbow, his palm rough as bark. The touch was not cruel, but it was final, the way a butcher's hand is final when it settles on the chosen lamb. Eliza pulled the blindfold down then. The last of the light was gone, only a thin moon hung above the pines like a chipped coin. She saw the black mare tied to the fence rail, saw the new halter on its head, saw her own small bundle of clothes already lashed behind the saddle. And she saw the two brothers standing side by side, neither able to meet her eyes. The understanding came all at once, cold and complete, flooding her body the way creek water floods a low place after hard rain. She opened her mouth, but the sound that came out was small, more animal than human. Caleb turned away first. He took the mare's reins from Amos's hand, ran his palm down the animal's neck as though testing the bargain one final time, then swung up into the saddle. The horse danced under his weight, eager to be gone. Eliza tried to step back, but Amos's grip tightened. The mare snorted once, hooves ringing on the frozen ground as Caleb spurred her down the trail without looking back. The sound of those hooves faded into the trees, carrying away the last 3 years of her life, and still Amos held her, patient as winter, while the night closed its fist around them both. Amos led her through the gate and up the narrow path to the old tobacco barn that sat half-swallowed by the hillside. The door hung crooked on leather hinges and moaned when he pushed it open. Inside, the air was thick with the sweet rot smell of last year's cured leaves still hanging in blackened strings from the rafters. A single lantern burned on an upturned stump, throwing a weak circle of light that barely reached the corners. Shadows crawled over the packed dirt floor like living things. He closed the door behind them and dropped the wooden bar across it with a sound that struck Eliza's heart like a coffin lid. For a moment neither moved. The only noises were the wind worrying the tin roof and the soft shift of the mare outside, already tethered to the fence and waiting for a master who would never again be hers. Eliza backed away until her shoulders met the rough wall of poplar logs. Her shawl had slipped, the cold raised gooseflesh along her arms, but she felt it only dimly, as though her body belonged to someone else. Amos stood between her and the door, hat in his hands now, turning it round and round the way a man turns a worry stone when the words won't come. "I ain't goin' to hurt you," he said at last, voice low, almost pleading. "It's done legal between kin." Caleb signed a paper. He reached inside his coat and drew out a folded sheet, the kind of cheap store paper that yellowed quick in mountain damp. He held it toward the lantern so she could see the crooked X that was Caleb's mark and, beneath it, Amos's own careful schoolboy script. Eliza stared at the paper the way a condemned man stares at the rope, and something inside her chest tore loose with a sound she refused to let past her teeth. She lunged for the door. The bar was heavy, but terror gave her strength. She had it halfway up when Amos caught her around the waist and pulled her back. She kicked, clawed, bit the fleshy part of his hand until she tasted blood, but he only wrapped his thick arms tighter and lifted her clear off the ground. Her shoes scraped furrows in the dirt as he carried her deeper into the barn. When he set her down she spun and raked her nails across his cheek, opening 3 red lines that beaded instantly. For a heartbeat she thought he would strike her, his eyes flashed with something older than anger. Instead he caught her wrists and pinned them against a support post, breathing hard, the lantern light flickering across the fresh blood on his face. Outside, the mare whickered once, uneasy. Far down the ridge a dog began to bark and then suddenly stopped, as though something had closed its throat. Eliza screamed then, a sound torn raw from the bottom of her lungs, high and thin and hopeless. It poured out of the barn, threaded between the rafters, and spilled into the frozen pines, but the trees only took it and gave nothing back. The holler was empty of any living soul that might have answered. Amos pressed his forehead to hers, his breath sour with liquor and regret. "Hush now," he whispered, almost tender. "It's done. You're mine now. Best we both get used to it." Her next scream broke in the middle, became a ragged sob that shook her whole frame. The lantern flame guttered in a draft, throwing their shadows tall and monstrous against the hanging leaves. And still the night held its breath, waiting for what came next. The first traveler to speak of it was a peddler named Silas McCoy, who came down off the ridge 3 weeks after Eliza disappeared, his pack half empty and his face the color of tallow. He took supper at the Whitaker cabin, Caleb's cabin still, though no one called it that anymore, and drank 3 cups of chicory coffee before he found the nerve. Then he leaned across the table and told Caleb that something walked the old trace road after moonset, something that sounded like a woman crying his name. He said the voice was thin, carried on the wind the way a thread of smoke carries, and that it knew things, the name of Caleb's childhood dog, the scar on his knee from the time he fell through the ice on Laurel Fork, the lie he told the preacher about why he never came to meeting anymore. The peddler swore the words floated between the pines like lantern light through fog, close enough to touch 1 minute and gone the next, leaving only the smell of wet earth and something sweeter, like wilted locust blossoms. After that, no one traveled the ridge alone at night. Teamsters left Pineville before dusk and pushed their mules hard to reach the valley before full dark. A preacher on his circuit rode past Amos's place with his Bible clutched to his chest and later told his wife he heard a woman singing a hymn inside the barn, soft and mournful, though the doors were barred and no lamp showed. Children sent to gather chestnuts came home early, claiming they heard footsteps keeping pace with them just inside the tree lean, never hurried, never falling behind. Even the dogs felt it. They would not cross the footbridge after sunset, no matter how their masters coaxed or cursed. Old Blue, Caleb's best hound, took to sleeping under the porch with his paws over his ears, whimpering in his sleep until Caleb kicked him out into the cold. And always, beneath the woman's voice, another sound threaded the dark, the slow, deliberate clop of hooves on frozen ground, unshod, heavy, moving without hurry along paths no horse had business walking at night. Men began to notice that the cries grew clearer when the wind came from the west, from the direction of Amos's barn. On still nights the voice seemed to stand right at the edge of the clearing, close enough that a man could almost make out the words. Some swore they heard laughter mixed in with the weeping, the kind of laughter that has no mirth in it, only teeth. Caleb took to keeping the cabin door barred before the sun was fully down and a loaded rifle across his knees while he sat by the fire. He told himself it was wolves, or painters, or the wind playing tricks, but his hands shook when he poured the whiskey, and he no longer slept in the loft where Eliza used to lie. Instead he dozed in his chair, jerking awake at every creak of the settling logs, certain that something stood just outside the greased paper window, breathing frost across the panes and waiting for him to close his eyes again. Up on the ridge, Amos nailed an extra crossboard over the barn door and never opened it after dark. Yet those who passed at twilight claimed they saw a faint glow between the cracks, the color of old blood, and heard the soft rustle of a woman moving inside, pacing the length of the dirt floor in shoes that made no sound at all. March came in wet and reluctant, the ridge still locked under patches of dirty snow when the traveling preacher, Reverend Elias Crouch, rode the trace road on his raw-boned mule. He was a gaunt man with a voice like a cracked bell, known for camping wherever night found him and for never turning from a door, no matter how mean. On the third night out from Pineville he made his fire beside a lightning-scarred chestnut oak that marked the boundary between Caleb's land and Amos's. The tree stood alone in a small clearing, its roots clutching the hillside like desperate fingers. While he waited for his coffee to boil, the preacher noticed something glinting among the roots, small, gold, half buried in leaf mold. He hooked it out with the tip of his knife, Eliza's wedding ring, the plain band Caleb had bought from a Jew peddler in Harlan, still bearing the tiny dent where she had once struck it against the grindstone. The ring had been driven onto a rusty tenpenny nail and hedged into the trunk at eye level, hammered so deep the metal head was flush with the bark. Nailed above it, like a crude horseshoe over a doorway, hung an old iron shoe, cold forged, its calks worn smooth by years of mountain rock. Reverend Crouch stood a long while staring, the ring turning slowly on his little finger. Then he saw the tracks. They began at the base of the tree and circled it 7 times exactly, each circuit pressed deep into the half-frozen ground as though made by a heavy animal walking slow. Hoofprints, unmistakably a horse's, yet no set of prints ever left the circle. There was no trail coming in, none leading away. The track simply began, went round and round the tree like a dog pacing its chain, and then stopped, the final print deeper than the rest, as if the creature had stood there a long time before vanishing between one heartbeat and the next. The preacher was not a man given to fear of signs, but something cold moved along his spine. He looked up through the bare branches at the pale coin of moon riding low and felt watched. From somewhere higher on the ridge came the soft, deliberate thud of a single hoof striking stone, once, then silence. He did not camp there after all. He poured his coffee on the fire, saddled the mule, and rode on through the dark with the wedding ring clenched in his fist and the taste of iron in his mouth. Word of the tree and its strange shrine traveled faster than the preacher himself. Men rode up to see it in daylight, hats in hand, speaking low. They measured the circle with their boots and found it perfect, 33 feet around, no more, no less. They pried at the horseshoe, but it would not come loose without taking half the tree with it. Children were forbidden to go near the place, yet every morning fresh frost showed the circle had been walked again in the night, the prints always beginning and ending at the same deep scar beside the roots. No one moved the ring. No one dared. It hung there catching what little light found its way through the leaves come spring, a small gold eye that never closed, watching the ridge road for the men who had put it there and the men who had accepted the price. The black mare came home with Caleb the same night Eliza disappeared, led down the ridge trail while the moon still hid behind the pines. He stabled her in the lean-to shed that had never held anything finer than a lame mule, and for the first days she seemed everything the bargain promised, strong-necked, glossy, calm under his hand. He curried her until she shone like spilled ink and fed her the last of the good corn, talking to her soft and low the way a man talks to a woman he has not yet earned. But by the end of the first week the horse began to change. She would stand at the fence rail staring up toward Amos's place long after dusk, ears pricked, nostrils flaring at wind that carried no sentiment could name. When Caleb tried to lead her past the spring house she planted her feet and trembled, sweat blooming dark along her shoulders though the night was cold. At feeding time she took one look at the trough, laid her ears flat, and swung her hindquarters as if to kick the boards loose. The corn lay untouched until the jays stole it. Then came the night she broke out. Caleb woke to the crash of splintering pine and found the stall door hanging by one hinge. The mare stood in the yard bathed in moonlight, head high, eyes rolling white. When he stepped toward her with the halter she wheeled and struck at him with a forefoot, the iron shoe whistling past his ear close enough to part his hair. He stumbled back, hard hammering, and watched her gallop to the edge of the clearing and stop dead at the tree lean, staring up the ridge as though someone stood there calling her name in a voice only she could hear. After that he kept her hobbled with a logging chain, but even chained she raged. She chewed the fence rails until her mouth bled, pawed a trench deep enough to bury a man to the knee, and screamed, not the high whicker of a lonely mare, but a deep, tearing sound that carried for miles and set every dog in the holler howling. Caleb took to sleeping with the rifle across his lap, jerking awake each time the chain rattled or the mare flung herself against the stall boards. Some mornings he found her standing motionless, head lowered, staring at a single spot on the wall where the chinking had fallen out. Frost would coat her whiskers, yet she did not shiver. Her eyes, black and liquid before, had taken on a dull red glow in certain lights, like coals under ash. Once, when he forced himself close enough to throw a blanket over her, he saw that the white star on her forehead had darkened to the color of old blood. Men who came to borrow a tool or buy a plug of tobacco left quicker than they arrived, muttering that the mare watched them the way a hanging judge watches the condemned. Children swore that when the wind blew down off the ridge the horse answered it, a low rumbling nicker that sounded almost like words. And always, no matter how Caleb turned her loose in the pasture by day, at dusk she fought to face the same direction, northwest, toward the tobacco barn where no lantern ever burned anymore, toward the circle of hoofprints that grew fresh every night around the scarred chestnut tree. November 17, 1889, fell on a Sunday, 1 year to the day since Caleb rode the black mare down from Amos's gate. The sky hung low and iron gray, the kind of sky that presses on a man's chest and makes dogs crawl under porches. Early frost still glittered when the first scream carried down the ridge, high and human, cut off sharp as an axe through meat. Old man Gentry found him just after sunrise. Amos lay in the corral beside the barn, one boot heel dug deep into the churned mud as though he had tried to drag himself clear. His chest was caved in, ribs stove like barrel staves under a wagon wheel. Blood had poured from his mouth and nose, thick and dark, already freezing into black rosettes on the ground. His eyes were wide open, filmed white, fixed on the barn door 20 feet away. That door stood ajar for the first time in months, the crossboard torn loose and hanging by a single nail. The tracks told the rest. Heavy, unshod hoofs had come straight down the hillside, breaking through laurel and deadfall without swerving. They entered the corral through the open gate, circled Amos twice, slow, deliberate, the way a wolf circles a wounded deer, then reared and came down again and again until the man was pulp. After the killing the prince walked to where Amos's head lay and stopped. There they simply ended, no stride away, no scatter of dirt, only the deep-paired scars of forehoofs planted as though the horse had stood a long while looking at what it had done before it vanished like smoke. In Amos's mouth someone had stuffed a scrap of brown calico, stiff with old blood and faded flowers. Eliza's apron, the one she wore the night she was led away. A few threads still clung to his broken teeth. The coroner from Pineville came 3 days later, took one look at the body and the tracks, and wrote, "Death by misadventure," because no other words fit the law's tongue. Men carried Amos up the ridge in a pine box and buried him beside his first wife without a preacher, for Reverend Crouch had not been seen since spring. They nailed the lid fast and piled stones high, yet the next morning the stones lay scattered and the fresh earth was torn open in a perfect circle of hoofprints, deep as if the weight of 10 horses had danced there. Down in Caleb's cabin the black mare stood quiet that week, head low, eating her corn like any ordinary beast. But those who passed close swore the white star on her forehead had turned the color of fresh spilled blood, and that when the wind came from the graveyard she lifted her muzzle and answered it with a sound too close to a woman's laugh. The boy's name was Lemuel Potter, 12 years old and small for his age, sent up the ridge at twilight to fetch the milk cow that had wandered again. It was late December 1889, the sky already the color of a fresh bruise, and the other children had refused to go with him after what happened to Amos. Lem carried his daddy's old horse pistol tucked in his belt and a lantern that smoked more than it lit, but courage is a thin coat when the dark starts breathing. He found the cow at the edge of the laurel hill above the scarred chestnut tree, standing still as a painted cow, staring at something down the deer path. Lem followed her gaze and felt the lantern tremble in his hand. She walked slow along the ridge line, maybe 30 yards off, barefoot in the frost, her brown calico dress hanging in ribbons that stirred though no wind touched the boy. Her hair, loose and black as wet coal, moved the same way. Beside her paced the black mare, no halter, no saddle, only a raw place around the neck where a rope had once burned deep. The horse's eyes caught the last of the light and threw it back red, like forge embers. Eliza stopped when she saw the boy. She lifted one hand, palm up, the way a body beckons a shy dog. The mare stopped too, ears forward, nostrils flaring steam into the cold. Lem smelled locust blossoms and wet earth and something underneath that made his stomach turn wrong side out. She spoke, and her voice carried clear though her lips barely moved. "Tell Caleb the trade was fair," she said, soft as a hymn and sharp as a skinning knife. "Tell him I kept my part. Now I come for his." The mare tossed her head and the sound that came out was not a whinny, it was laughter, low and wet, the same sound that had drifted from the corral the morning Amos died. Lem saw then that the horse's forehoofs were dark to the fetlock, dark and shining, and that the white star on her forehead had become a perfect handprint of blood. Eliza turned away. Woman and horse moved off together along the ridge, stepping where no path had ever been cut, the frost bending beneath them but never breaking. They did not hurry. They did not look back. The cow lowed once, mournful, and followed a few paces before Lem grabbed her rope and dragged her home, running until his lungs burned and the lantern shattered against a root. He told what he saw, voice cracking like green wood in a fire. Folks listened from doorways, faces pale, rifles across their knees. No one called him liar. No one rode up to check the ridge that night or any night after. Sometimes, when the wind swings down off the Cumberland and the dogs refuse to cross the creek, travelers still hear them moving together along the high ground, the slow measured fall of a woman's bare feet and the heavier fall of unshod hooves keeping perfect time. And always, just before the sounds fade into the pines, the same words drift back, patient as winter, patient as debt. He traded me fair. Now I trade him back.